Yeah, when no one was around.
$789.
Sounds like a lot of work in and of itself.
Yep. There's 21 of them on this.
Is that right? Good to go. This presentation's probably about 10, 12 minutes.
Challenge a lot of you are familiar with, and I know a lot of you have covered pieces of this story over the years, but just to reframe the challenge we face. We have a highway, famous Moses-era highway built late 40s, early 50s. It is, and like a lot of Moses infrastructure, unfortunately done on the cheap, substandard, hitting the end of its useful life. And as highways go, this one, which is, it's a series of bridges, but it's also a highway. It is one of the main interstates of New York City. It carries around 153,000 cars a day, which is an enormous volume of traffic. And there aren't, as you know, there aren't a lot of redundant highways nearby that you could potentially put that traffic on as you were trying to fix the existing structure. What one ordinarily does in other scenarios, and you can think about some of the big bridges that have happened, or what was done on the FDR Drive some years ago. When you have a bridge or a roadway that carries a huge volume of cars and you need to repair it, you will often build a temporary structure next to it, divert the traffic, and fix the existing structure. I think everybody knows our challenge here is we can't really put a highway right next to this one because we've got on one side, obviously, Brooklyn Heights, on the other side, park, residential buildings, hotels, etc. So the challenge we face is how really to completely replace, rehabilitate this aging, obsolete structure while trying not to create just terribly difficult, nightmarish traffic scenarios for not only Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island. I mean, really, this highway has such an impact on the traffic system almost of the entire city. So we're going to put out today, I think, a couple, and we've been working on this, as a lot of you know, really, I started working on this when I walked in the door here, now getting on towards 5 years ago. Can you believe it? But particularly, I'd say, in the past year, working really hard. We've done a lot of outreach to the community, but also sitting down with a lot of experts to really start to refine what are some options. We want to put a couple of them on the table today. I think people's first reaction is going to be, wow, these are some big things you're looking at. But this is an epic challenge. I like to say, unfortunately, this project, the closest analogy we can think to, and it's not perfectly like it, but it's more like a big dig than not. I mean, it is a sort of a project of that kind of a scope. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tanvi and Bob to start to walk through what we're looking at. And I just want to emphasize, we will be undertaking, starting next week, a big community outreach meeting. We talked to elected officials this morning. Obviously, we're talking to you all in the press. This will be the start of a big environmental process that will go for a couple years. So there will be a lot of time to get feedback from the community, from elected officials, from business leaders, to think about their ideas to incorporate, et cetera. But just one thing, unfortunately, with this roadway, time is not on our side. Some of you, I think Danielle was the one who wrote the story. You know, we've discovered, looking at the condition of this roadway that by around 2026, we're gonna have to start putting weight restrictions on it if we don't get it repaired, and that means diverting trucks to local roads. And I'll just say I was at a break fast last night with someone actually from the neighborhood who said, "Oh, why can't you just let it fall to the ground?" We cannot let it fall to the ground. It is, for better or for worse, some of these Moses-built highways, which we can all have our feelings about them, and parts of the city they destroyed, but now the city has grown around them, and it's not an option to just say, well, we can't deal with that traffic and rehabilitating that structure. All right, so with that, I turn it over to Tammy and Bob, and they can go through the slideshow.
So, my folks have been working to keep the roadway safe. We have a maintenance inspection and operations unit that goes out there, responds to calls we get. We've done temporary repairs, but this is getting way beyond what they can do. And to rehab this is not a good idea. I'm going to turn it over to Tammy. She's walk you through the presentation, and then we'll take whatever questions.
So this here we have is a video that kind of takes you through the corridor, because a lot of times even when you're driving you don't pay attention. So we start at Congress, there's Van Boris Park, bifurcated by on and off ramps. As you go further, you cross over Atlantic Avenue interchange, which is not great for pedestrians and bicyclists in addition to traffic. 360 Furman, very close to the structure. The yellow bands that you see going across are subway lines that are underneath. As you keep going, the promenade begins at Remsen at that end. Again, there's TA facilities across the street from us, the Brooklyn Bridge Park on the other side, of course, and the promenade and the buildings, the historic district abutting our structure. As you go around, you come underneath Columbia Heights. That's our pinch point vertically. That is the lowest vertical clearance there is. But also, it's very, very close to the buildings right there. This is one of our worst rated structures in this area, so we absolutely have to address it with a park sitting on top of it. And then as you go around it, we go underneath Brooklyn Bridge. Again, a very tight portal within which we have to fit. Continue through, then we go underneath Manhattan Bridge. Again, space is limited. We're never going to be able to redo anything with Manhattan or Brooklyn Bridge, so we have to make everything work within that envelope. So this is just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with. We're talking about 1.5 miles, and over that length of the corridor, structure types keep changing. The triple cantilever gets all of the attention, but the structure between Columbia Heights and Washington Street of BQE is very complex, and it's not an easy structure to replace or rehab without thinking about what do we do with traffic, which is an obvious question to everyone. And this is the condition we're dealing with, right? So triple cantilever, everything is combined. You cannot deal with one piece without dealing with all of it. That's one of the big challenges with this structure in itself, and it's all concrete, which is another challenging material to work with several non-standard features: narrow lanes, no shoulders, vertical height clearance problems, horizontal limited sight distance, so you come around a curve and you can't see what's ahead of you. This creates safety issues, creates one of the highest crash rated corridors around here. Next. So as we approach this project, one of the things we want to do is see what else can we do. This is not just about fixing the roadway. We have an opportunity here to do something more than that, right? We can combine Van Boris Park and make it more user-friendly. Make that whole corridor on Atlantic Avenue better, so that everybody going to Brooklyn Bridge Park and to the ferry has a safer corridor to walk through. Going further, there's been some interest in having direct connections from Brooklyn Heights Promenade down to Brooklyn Bridge Park, a direct route down. We have an opportunity to look into that. And then further up, the bigger thing is there's a missing connection, right? You get off Manhattan Bridge or Brooklyn Bridge, you have to go into the local street grid before you get to BQE. If there was a direct connection, that would be a significant improvement to that area over there. And that's something we want to look into. And that improves life for everyone in that whole corridor. So this is one of those structures where what you want to build is intrinsically tied to how you build it. There's no way to think about this without thinking about how we're going to build it. And what we looked at is not only we want to look at how we're going to build it, but we want to keep in mind that we have to go through an environmental process. We want to combine our design build concepts that thankfully we now have the design build option for delivering this project. But we want to give room to the design build community to come up with some innovative concepts, and we have to give them a big enough envelope that they can do that. So we looked at how could we do this. So we came up with two ways. The second one that we are calling traditional approach is something probably most of us are familiar with. You see a lane of construction, next lane over is where you're driving. A few months later you shift over, then the construction shifts, and you keep doing that till you're done. That's a fairly standard thing that most people are familiar with. We wanted to look at something else to see if there's another more innovative way to do it, and that's the elevated roadway. So we're going to go through that now. And keep in mind, these are just concepts for thinking. We want to see how wide an envelope we can lay out for the design build community, what can we review under the environmental process, and then what will actually get built is going to be dependent on the competition that's out there amongst the designers and builders. The difference between the two, the elevated roadway gets us to substantial completion, which means putting the traffic back down where it belongs on the redone new BQE in 6 years, approximately. There's better opportunity to improve the safety and the geometry of the roadway with this concept. And it is much more schedule and cost certainty there, because what we're doing is a little more defined compared to the traditional approach. As we go through it, you'll see what I mean about that. We can also get there doing the traditional approach, but the cost certainty and particularly the schedule certainty is much less with that. We're talking about 8 years plus, which is a significant difference in the timeline. And also, while it doesn't impact the promenade dramatically for the entire duration, we certainly do still need to replace the promenade. Promenade is a structure, as much as everybody thinks of it as a park. It is actually a bridge of sorts, so it does need to be replaced. So what are we talking about with this elevated roadway? What we're saying is we would build columns along Furman Street. And this structure, this is just a type of structure that we use for illustrative purposes. It could be whatever the design teams come up with. During overnight hours, we're allowed to go to single lanes. They would go to the lower level, and then the upper level is where the construction would occur. So this is only during overnight that we would need to do these lane shifts. The promenade would be removed from the top. It has to be done rather piecemeal to account for so much proximity of infrastructure. We put a sheeting behind the existing wall. Then we are able to put in columns to support the future superstructure that we need to put in for the elevated roadway. All of this work, again, being done during overnight hours, so we're not over live traffic for anything. And once that elevated roadway is ready, we can take all the traffic and put it to that upper level. That upper level is at about the promenade level. When that's there, this whole lower area is available for the contractor to do the demolition and rebuilding, right? So then they can begin with removing the old wall that exists, which requires removal of the dirt behind it. There's some infrastructure back there that we also have to handle. Remove the existing structure. Furman Street remains open. Traffic is continuing day in, day out upstairs. Down here, the work is being done during daytime hours, so the noise issues and all the issues that go with nighttime construction are eliminated. Here we're showing a concept of soil nailing. Again, this depends on what the design build team comes up with. And then we can rebuild the wall, separating the structure from Brooklyn Heights, and then replace the promenade portion, the trees that we had to remove to do this construction. Once that is done, traffic moves back down to the newly built roadway. And then we have the opportunity to do what we would like with the promenade. Now we have an expanded promenade that we can reconfigure, reprogram to suit the expectations of the community, bring it back to perhaps a better place. So that's one way of building. This is something we would like to see. As this continues, obviously this goes at this level all the way over Columbia Heights, and then we do a little bit of a bypass that gives us the freedom to work between Columbia Heights and Washington Street in one shot, keeping all the traffic on this bypass. What that does for us is it gives us much more freedom to move the alignments around vertically and horizontally to get the best features as far as the vertical clearances and the horizontal alignments. We can get this greater width of the Brooklyn Promenade, but also it lets us make these direct connections to Brooklyn Bridge and Manhattan Bridge without any additional closures, right? We can do it within the construction that we're already doing, which is a huge gain. And then that by itself improves the connectivity and pedestrian experience throughout the whole area. So what we're talking about in terms of timeline, it would take around 1.5 years to build that elevated roadway. Once the traffic is up there, in another 3 to 4 years, the replacement structure would be built. So that's what the 6-year timeline we're talking about is, from the time they start to when they put the traffic back down to the newly built structure is 6 years. During that time, essentially the traffic wouldn't feel much of a difference during the daytime hours. It would be the same configuration that they use most of the time. The difference, the thing that would be definitely of concern to most residents of the area is the promenade will be closed during the 6 years. And that is something that we are certainly looking to see how to handle and see if we can incentivize contractors to shorten that duration. That is a dramatic impact. Trees would have to be removed along that corridor of the promenade, whether we do it this way or any other way, because of where the wall is and where the trees are. We need to keep a certain distance to maintain tree line, and we just don't have that kind of space around here. So if you were not going to do something that dramatic, what's the normal traditional way to do it? We would still have to build foundations along Furman Street. We would fit a lane alongside, start demoing the existing structure. This is now being done at overnight hours because you can only fit one lane. So now we're talking about a lot of work being done at night, which is why the length of construction is much longer, because the productivity during overnight hours is much shorter. By the time they set up, they're removing. You also see there's a lot of modification of the existing structure that needs to be done. This is kind of like doing surgery at night in 3-4 hours every night. Something goes wrong with any of these types of effort overnight, we could really have an issue opening up lanes. If they find a bigger issue when they're trying to make this modification, everything has to stop until we figure out how to get around that issue. Once all that traffic is over on this bi-level structure that's been built, then the construction on the old structure can begin, and then all of that would be replaced. So the impacts that we talked about earlier with the tree line and the promenade being closed, all of those occur at that point. So the durations are slightly different, but the impact is the exact same. Also notice that Furman Street essentially becomes a covered roadway, and it will stay that way once the work is finished, because the foundations have been built. We wouldn't be rebuilding an entire line of foundations. So that is a permanent status of Furman Street, with having a roadway above and a line of column for the full length of Furman Street. Similar to the one before, we would do soil nailing, replace the wall, and finish up the structure, so that now you have, again, the two-level structure would be back. And then we can shift the traffic back east again so that it's not quite so close. We get our 12-foot lanes, we get the shoulders, but we cannot control the vertical geometry to the same extent as we did before, because we are tied to the existing structure. So vertically, we have to stay more or less where we are. So that's a big difference between the two. And again, when we're finished, we get the promenade back, it's reopened, but it's not going to be a wider promenade because we don't have anywhere to put the columns for it. So that's what a traditional way would be. It does give us most of the same benefits in the sense of improving some of the safety features, eliminating the vibration issues that a lot of the residents have been having. It reduces the time length that the promenade is closed, but the tree loss is the same, and there is a time frame when promenade does have to close. This also makes it difficult to make the direct connection to Brooklyn Bridge and Manhattan Bridge. We would need additional weekend closures to do this work. Some of the work we talked about there was being done in overnight hours, but when you talk about the roadway between Columbia Heights in itself, under Brooklyn Bridge, and some of the old Fulton Bridge and so on, those require complete closures. And when we're talking complete closures, we're talking Friday night to Monday morning. That is a serious closure, and we would need several of them to finish the work this way. So this is where we think there's a huge gain by doing the elevated roadway. The other concern is obviously the cost and schedule. So I kind of froze it at this point just to kind of indicate, see how the seat is being changed for that existing structure to receive that new beam. It needs a place to sit now. So that kind of work has to be done over and over and over for the whole length of Furman, which is a very difficult task to do. And if something goes wrong, everything slows down. The final configuration leaves that line of column along Furman Street all the way down to 360 Furman, so it's in the sidewalk in front of 360 Furman. Most of this work also has to be done overnight hours, which is a much bigger issue with the noise complaints that most residents have when there's construction in the overnight hours. And then we talked a little bit about these cattle chutes, right? So this is a picture from Harlem River Drive. This is something I think we're all familiar with. When you get to that point and you have to decide, should I go left, right, everybody slows down. And that leads to a lot of queuing, right? Everybody's typically through this kind of roadway, as we're trying to weave over 1.5 miles, we have TA structures that we have to get around. There's gonna be weaves in this. That leads to slowdown of traffic to sometimes up to 10 miles an hour. That's a big difference when you look at BQEs always going slow. So if you're going even slower, that's gonna really spill into a lot of backup all over the place. What that means is people are gonna look for alternate routes. These days with technology, immediately you're gonna get optional routes, and that just means there's very limited places to go that gets you through the same corridor. These streets are already fairly clogged, so having people jump off, especially trucks, and going into the neighborhoods is definitely not a desirable condition. What we've seen is if the 3 lanes are open but they are slowed down because of this weave condition, you could have up to 12,000 vehicles that are not going through as quickly as they used to before, which means you could have up to 3 miles of backup at either end of this condition. These are people that are gonna jump off and try to find another way to get around. If, God forbid, something happens and we're not able to open up the lanes right away in the morning because something went wrong in the overnight condition, and when you're talking 4, 5, 6, 7 years worth of construction, something likely will go wrong. You're talking way bigger gridlock. You're talking 7-mile impact, 12-mile impact going Staten Island, Queens, and regionally really messing things up. So there's a big challenge with traffic impacts with this way of doing construction. So what we're looking to do as far as the next few steps is to really talk this through to the public. We understand this is a kind of a scary situation they're looking at, and we want to walk them through it. We want to give them the reasons why we're doing it, work with them to make it as pain-free as we can. We're not saying it will be completely pain-free, but we'll try and help them through this. While we're doing all that, we're going to talk to obviously our state and FHWA partners, try to get our design build team on board. We have to get through the environmental process. So this is a couple years in the works yet. And so during that time, we will continue talking to groups of people, stakeholders, community boards, elected officials, and so on. So you will see a lot of us everywhere. And we have a good website that we try and keep updated. So we encourage public to keep an eye on that website. We will definitely advertise every workshop, meeting, event that we have over there. And there's a lot of background information there as well. So with that, we can take questions.
Last bit about the 3 miles of backup and the 12,000 vehicles per direction during the peak hour going on the neighborhood roads. That's for the traditional approach.
Yeah, can you pull that?
Yeah, go back. She can go
Can you
into
slide down a little bit towards the microphone?
Yeah, can you go back to that? Thanks, Ellen. Wait,
No, one up.
yeah.
Yeah. This is where we're saying so the first one is saying 3 lanes are open, but we've narrowed them with the barriers because we're trying to snake 3 lanes through a construction zone essentially. That slows everybody down. It makes everybody nervous, and that results in a severe backup in most of these areas especially with a long corridor of construction.
And when there is actually a crash, if you've ever seen one happen where cars are stuck driving between a set of Jersey barriers, you essentially have to pull all the traffic ahead of them out and then back in a tow truck, emergency vehicle, whatever, to get them out. So unfortunately also if something does go wrong, it's very difficult to recover.
But the 3-lane, 2-lane, 1-lane scenarios pertain to the traditional or innovative?
It's more likely to occur under the traditional because we're doing so much complicated work in the overnight hours. So if something goes wrong and we're not able to return the lanes to the normal 3-lane configuration, because during the overnight hours we would have to go down to 1 lane or 2 lane to do the work. So if you're not able to return all the lanes back like we normally would, that could lead to these substantial delays, because BQE is one of those roads that even 5, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, it's starting to back up. There isn't a lot of window where you can say, you know, the peak hour is until 8 o'clock and we have time to recover. It just immediately starts spiraling.
On the innovative plan where you're building the superstructure and putting the 2 lanes up where the promenade is now, would that be a permanent superstructure, or are you building it twice, temporarily and then permanently, to finish it off?
It's temporarily used as a roadway, but the structure itself is permanent for the promenade length. There's, you know, and from Atlantic to get to that level, there is some temporary structure that would come out. Similarly, beyond Columbia Heights, there is structure that would come out. But in that promenade area, that becomes the new promenade.
But I want to make sure we're really clear. The reason we're calling it temporary is if we go with a concept where the roadway is at promenade level, that is not permanent. We would take the roadway back down. We could leave some piece of that structure to make the promenade bigger, to make it nicer, or not, or take the promenade back to its original dimensions. But the roadway would come down, just to want to make sure, because I think that can be confusing.
How many lanes would the roadway be, the temporary roadway be in both directions?
3 lanes in each direction.
Similar to current.
Which is what the BQE is now. It's 3 lanes in each direction.
So
Just
it's
that
not like a matter of that, like half the BQE could stay open and half the traffic would, it would just be completely shut down.
Right, because that, and again, sort of to go back to this slide, I mean, this is the challenge we face. If you, again, if this were a highway in the middle of Montana, which of course it isn't, you would just, you know, rebuild a temporary highway of the same dimensions next to it and say to the contractor, now you can just have free range, go fix the whole thing in one fell swoop. If you are taking little pieces of it, then the contractor doesn't have that ability to do things quickly and more easily in the one fell swoop. So, but to do that, yeah, you have to recreate the full capacity of the existing roadway at one level.
And where would that existing roadway then go back to meet the current structures of the BQE?
Our limits go from Atlantic Avenue to Sands, so we
Okay.
would connect back up at those 2 ends.
Okay.
But I mean, generally, we're staying within the footprint of where we are, right? Our goal is not to get out of that footprint, not to affect the parklands that are around. If anything, create more open space. So we're trying to stay in that tight box.
And could you go back over the projects in comparing the cost estimates?
We pull that, Sally, pull that
Liz?
slide up.
Okay, thank you.
Wasn't the original price 1.7 million?
Yeah, I mean, the original price was our preliminary estimate, and I guess it will surprise no one to know as we have sort of gotten deeper into the work and really considered the complexities of the project, and inflation has eaten into what the original price was. And frankly, I think when you look at these prices, and I've talked to some of my counterparts who've done other sort of similar big interstate reconstruction work in other major urban areas, you're in the billions. I mean, it's an excellent question. I mean, this is sort of what the environmental process and now the community outreach process will be all about. And look, I think you all are sitting here absorbing this. Usually, you know, we showed this to elected officials this morning, and they were certainly absorbing, I think, the very challenging trade-offs between the two approaches. There are, I think, for the temporary elevated roadway, bigger benefits, but definitely some very acute downsides.
What was the reaction to the post comment?
Sorry?
What was the reaction to the post comment?
I mean, look, I think there is, for people who've been following this project closely, I think everyone, I mean, the promenade itself is 70-ish years old, and I think For people who sort of have immersed themselves in the history of the BQE, they know that I've had, Brooklyn Heights residents say to me, like, we know Robert Moses built the thing on the cheap. And that this day would come when it would need to be replaced, reconstructed, rehabilitated. That said, I think, obviously as we really, having spent now a couple of years really refining a harder look at how that gets done, I think for everyone to take a look at it, obviously, it's a lot to absorb. This project is huge, and it's, its impacts are huge as well.
Can I just go back and add one thing to the previous question that you had, is how would you decide between the two? Really what we're doing is not trying to decide a specific method. We're trying to lay out what is our threshold, what is the level of pain, so to speak, we're willing to take, so that we then go to the design builders and say, okay, here's your box. You need to innovate within this box. So this is not to say that this is the done deal, this is the exact way we're going to do it. We're just trying to lay out what is our threshold, how do we determine how far we can go. Because if we set them up with a very small window within which to work, there isn't room to innovate. There isn't room to do anything special, and we're kind of boxing them into a very tight window. So just want to make that clear. We're not saying this is the way, but we're trying to lay out that groundwork.
Is there ever going to be a time where the city isn't haunted by the ghost of Robert Moses? Like, was there ever a thought about maybe studying, what traffic policies need to be in place to actually maybe shut down this section of the BQE and, reduce congestion to a point where you can absorb, do that, or,
I mean, it's funny, and you're right. It's a fair question that this raises. Could a congestion pricing scheme be a help here? Is a fair question. I would say, I think, as I sort of said in my introductory remarks, one of the things we were forced to conclude, again, to speak to the local Brooklyn Heights resident who said half jokingly to me, "Let the darn thing fall down." A highway that carries 153,000 vehicles a day, including a lot of trucks. It's I certainly think we want to think in the long run about, is there ways we can reduce the number of vehicles going through New York City? And, one of our challenges, right, is we are a city that gets almost all our freight via truck. We are not well connected to the mainland with freight rail connections, which is how almost every other American city gets some amount of its freight. It's a fair question, but I think our problem here is we have some urgency with this roadway. It's nearing the end of its useful life. As you know, I think the city, and personally, I hope there are a lot of great debates that are happening in Albany and elsewhere about how we might tackle the growth of vehicular traffic in the city. Can I envision a day when the BQE will sort of not be a vitally needed artery? I can't picture it in the coming decades, unfortunately.
In either technique, are you looking at any particularly newly innovative construction techniques, like the way they had the pre-built road sections for the Tappan Zee Bridge with the world's largest crane? Does the river provide any options for that? Can you bring stuff in pre-built and slap it in place? Or anything else that's innovative?
I could answer this. So we are going to go out design build. We are hoping that the design builder will come in with those ideas. We're not opposed to prefabricated construction. We think that it would certainly speed the construction along. There's not a whole lot of room out there to bring stuff in, truckloads of concrete at times. So we do expect to see some of that in the design build proposals we get. We haven't, what we're doing now is trying to make sure there's a way to do this, right? So we came up with these two ways. We're looking for the design build community to come back to us when we go out and propose even more innovation. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah, I would just add one thing. I mean, it's part of why we were so passionate about getting design build for this project. I mean, I think you all can see this is a task we approach with humility. We are keenly desirous to have right. I mean, there are firms all around the country and all around the world that have built some extraordinary projects. And I think as much as we have an amazing team, and we've had some outside consultants, and we've done charrettes with panels of expert engineers, part of the beauty of design build is we're not going to tell the firms every little thing they need to do in the design. They can come bring us their best ideas. And we hope they will come up with some things that will say, wow, what a great idea. We didn't think of it, but that'll save 6 months or $100 million or some amount of noise and inconvenience, and we'll see what they bring to the table.
Just to be clear, the
but less so, because I mean, once you essentially build that temporary roadway above, it's a normal 6-lane roadway. And everything that happens underneath, whatever wacky, there's when Moses built this thing, he left like old pump stations and pieces of wood and stuff stuck in there. Whatever scary things you find underneath, traffic is flowing up on top. And as opposed to sort of trying to manage the traffic lanes in the existing structure, it's just, it's not to say there's no traffic impacts on the temporary elevated roadway either, but I think that's one thing we feel confident of. That one will be less awful in terms of traffic, significantly less awful. Am I safe in saying that? Significantly less awful?
For sure.
Why not a tunnel?
Good question.
So we've done some tunnel studies. We've talked about it extensively with public and others. I think we even have presentations on our website if someone really wants to dig into it. But essentially, we know how city is. There's a lot of things under the ground. Everything is not just what you see, right? So we looked at 7 different alignments of putting a tunnel in. Out of the 7, only 2 were actually feasible. Remaining 5 would have hit one or the other subway tunnel or the massive water tunnels that were built by DEP not so long ago. So when you eliminate those 5, that left 2. One of them would have gone underneath Manhattan Bridge, Brooklyn, Anchorage. Not a desirable thing to do to a iconic bridge. That left one option. That one option would have been basically a complete bypass. That means anybody that's trying to get to Brooklyn Bridge, Manhattan Bridge is all going through the local street network. And there's obviously no entry and exits on a tunnel, right? You get in at one end and get out at the other end. In addition, based on the size of the current boring machines that exist, you could only fit 2 lanes in there, right? So 2 lanes in each direction. We have 3 now, and those get clogged. So you can imagine 2 lanes wasn't going to cut it. So now we would have to do another tunnel, and I don't know that we could find space for a second tunnel. So that's where we put the tunnel aside. If someone wants to build a bypass, be my guest. I still need to worry about this bridge.
Yeah, I think I would just to summarize again, there really was not a feasible alignment to build a tunnel under this part of Brooklyn. And I think if you've looked at other cities, I mean, you can turn and look at Seattle where they're doing a big tunnel. They're taking down an elevated highway. Not an easy thing. You may have read about it. They had a tunnel boring machine called Big Bertha that got stuck for a year. A lot of the buildings started to see foundations crack. Even the alignment, which doesn't even sort of work from a transportation point of view, you would have to sort of go through most of brownstone Brooklyn, and I'm not sure that I even feel like the world has tunneling technology that is good enough to build what would potentially be 3 tunnels under one of the most historic parts of the city.
Any more questions? I've already emailed
Good luck.
All right.
We're gonna need it.
Thank you. Thank you guys for coming
you.
today.